stinks.
Yeah, it stinks. I hold my nose all the way to the bank. You know, that's money you're smelling, baby. I ain't no poor boy no more. I found out a lot of people work for stink money. I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings.
You know, when you're talking about Hicksploitation, I think that's a kind of an invented word. You're really talking about movies that were made primarily or thoughtfully for a Southern audience. That was something that existed literally since movies were invented. The South was a kind of an unusual market because there were lots and lots of movie palaces, some dating back to the 1880s when they had been vaudeville theaters and things like that, and they were converted into movie theaters for silent films. It was at a time when the South was, we were not that far from the Civil War, and so movie theaters and things like that were located in major cities, and as you went out away from, say, Birmingham, Alabama, or Louisville, Kentucky, or places like that where they had these beautiful movie theaters, the hinterlands did not. And the small towns would have small theaters, but they were not part of theater chains from the major studios. So even in the early silent era, independent productions that were kind of designed around the Southern audience existed. One of the very first, really, of record was a film called Moonshine, Molly, starring Mae Marsh. It was made in 1914. And the director was Christy Cabani, who had been a longtime associate of D.W. Griffith and had been actually an assistant director to Griffith with Raoul Walsh. And it was a pure Kentucky story about a girl who falls in love with a fellow who he's actually a teacher. He's come to this small town, and her father is in prison for committing a murder. What she suspects is that the crooked sheriff there in the town had actually committed the homicide, which he did. The sheriff is in love with her, and to get rid of this new competition, this handsome young guy, played by Wallace Reed, he turns him over to these feral hillbillies, telling them that he's a revenue agent. And in fact, he was not. He was a Pinkerton who was sent there to go undercover and catch the crooked sheriff. And Dad gets released, and Mae Marsh and Wallace Reed end up married at the end. But that setting and the whole thing of illegal liquor, and it was Kentucky, and if you step outside of a certain boundary in a township or whatever, you might as well be in the jungles of South America, because everybody in the woods is crazy, and they're there with their beards and their rifles and all of that stuff. And that was a cliched image that Hollywood, they looked at the reality and then expanded it and expanded it and expanded it. But it was something that stuck with audiences as to what life below the Mason-Dixon line really was about. One of the greatest silent films of all time kind of went counter to that, and that was Tolerable David, directed by Henry King. King's really huge success came later when he was a director at 20th Century Fox with The Song of Bernadette and a brilliant Western, The Gunfighter. Of course, he also directed Jesse James with Tyrone Power and Henry Fonda. But Tolerable David was considered one of the absolute finest silent films ever made. It's a beautiful movie, but it is about life in the West Virginia mountains. And Richard Barthelmess is this young guy who is basically trying to prove himself to his neighbors and what would be considered this kind of West Virginia community who were dismissive of him. And he becomes a hero. And it's a wonderful movie. It was actually John Ford's, that and another film called The Honor System were his two favorite silent movies. Again, we were looking at this perception of what life was in these areas of the United States. Famous comedians from that period, generally those, whether it was Max Sennett or Hal Roach or whoever it was, the background for many of those shorts and the most famous, whether it was Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton or Harold Lloyd or whatever. It was the city. That image of the silent comedian generally was someone from the city who was involved with city shenanigans, until Buster Keaton made one of his all-time most brilliant, in fact, it's considered his masterpiece, The General. But it is a Civil War story, and on the Confederate side. So all of these elements are kind of fitting in, and of course, when you're playing a movie like The General in Southern theaters and what have you, it is hitting those heartstrings, it's hitting those enthusiasms. As sound was dawning and exploitation was coming from small studios and small film companies, because they did not own theaters, so theater owners, in whether they were in Mississippi or Georgia or Tennessee or Florida, wherever it was, the ones who owned the smaller theaters, they were renting primarily Westerns, but they were renting the independently produced movies because they were not able to afford the studio films. And the studios owned the theaters around them, and they were acquiring more and more theaters so that they were supplying that big budget product. Suddenly, okay, where do we look? Well, they were going to look at the smaller companies that were producing movies, and as sound came in, that just kind of exploded. And in fact, that also ushered in the small producers who were looking for things that were quote-unquote adults only and very seamy and had huge exploitation elements, particularly in the area of let's get an older man and a younger woman together, which seemed to be the great cliche image of the South, was the child bride and the older drunken husband that she marries, and then suddenly the door opens for all sorts of taboo subjects to be explored in these early sound films. As sound came in and the major studios were making movies already set in the South was usually an excuse for shootings, lots of actresses in nightgowns and being very slinky, and somebody's drunk, and there was always something was kind of scandalous going on and what have you, because it felt like these high temperatures and high tempers, and people were always falling into bed with each other and all this type of stuff, and the South seemed to be the perfect setting for that type of thing. Hays Code was pushed to the limit by a lot of these movies. One very much in particular, Cabin in the Cotton, where Bette Davis has the immortal line, "I'd love to kiss you, but I just washed my hair." And that really started to the ball rolling. Another film she was in, Border Town. And that was the setting in Texas. Getting away, if you will, with all of these kind of scandalous things and all these sexual overtones and the double entendres and all of that stuff all seem to stem from this location of this is going to happen in Georgia, this is going to happen in Tennessee or what have you. Even though if they never left Burbank to make the movie, they still use that as their excuse.
I was talking with Mrs. Hayworth yesterday. You know, she's the sister of the famous Chicago specialist, Dr. Ashley. She tells me he has some wonderful films explaining childbirth. But best of all, she says he's due here for arrest in October.
Do you suppose we could get him to talk to a small group like ours?
Well, I'll ask her to write to him about it. You never know till you try.
Now, on the exploitation front, and let's hit the actual audience that these movies are being made about, but let's give them something to watch themselves. Kroger Babb was an exploitation exhibitor and film producer who kind of dominated the South in the 1930s. He believed in advertising could do absolutely anything. And he had made a fortune in these small towns in all of the southern states with a film called Mom and Dad. It was directed by William Bodine, who had had a wild up and down career directing everybody from Mary Pickford and W.C. Fields all the way into the 60s, where he directed episodes of The Green Hornet with Bruce Lee. This exploitation film was considered quote-unquote adults only, because they had spliced footage of an actual baby being born onto the end of the film. So Kroger Babb would go into a small town in the South with mom and dad and claim it was educational, which is how they got around censorship rules and things like that. And they would show that movie, and they would hand out birth control pamphlets and things like that. Now, on the other side of still the exploitation, he had a film called The Prince of Peace, which was about an evangelical preacher. And there they would be showing that on the other side of town, and they would be handing out Bibles and tracts about the religious services shown in the movie, until he would get run out of town by whoever, whatever sheriff was there.
You hit me again, Ira. I'll kill you. Kill you. But Daddy!
So he decided to go ahead and make a film that went directly to the core of the cliche of Southern, if you will, sexuality, and also what everybody would perceive as stuff going on down south, and that was Child Bride. Child Bride was notorious almost from the get-go because it was an older man marries a little girl. In this case, she was 13 years old, and she had a nude scene. And for a 13-year-old to gallop around in the altogether was pretty scandalous stuff. And this is 1937, and the film, everyone, they just flocked to go see it. But here it was, for real, this young girl, and she's swimming, and she's being spied on, and all this stuff by all these older, lascivious Southern characters. And the actress who played the child bride, name was Shirley Mills, and she was actually cast as the youngest Jode child in John Ford's Grapes of Wrath. And she was also in Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt.
Oh, Mommy, I don't want to go.
Jenny, you're my wife now, and it's time to go home. It's getting late.
This film just hit every single one of these outlying theaters. One of the things we have to remember is that there were still parts of these states, say in Alabama or Arkansas or Mississippi, where movie theaters were scattered. In those cases, they had truck theaters, where a fellow would come in a pickup truck with a 35 or 16 millimeter projector in the back, stacked with film cans, and he would set up shop either in a church or at a local meeting hall, and that's how people were seeing their movies. And what movies was he going to bring with him? Well, he was going to bring the latest Westerns from Monogram and Republic and PRC and all of that stuff. And that was really gaining momentum as the major studios were focusing on their own product, but in an odd way, although they were setting movies in the South, they were not gearing them really for Southern audiences. So it opened up this gateway for these smaller companies to come right in with individuals like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and all those great Republic Western stars to become bigger stars to an audience that if they didn't have access to the movies, they did have access to radio.
Uncle Reuben was our uncle, went to the city to have his fling. He came back and then by cracky, told us how to do the swing.
As far as what the studios were doing with Southern stories, for anything that was not just a melodrama and what they thought would hit with a Southern audience, they were comedies. 20th Century Fox, for example, did Kentucky Moonshine with the Ritz brothers and John Carradine. And in that case, it's the Ritz brothers pretending to be hillbillies and getting into basically a Hatfield and McCoy's type war, and without meaning to. Warner Brothers did one of the oddest films set in that venue called Swing Your Lady, in which Humphrey Bogart plays a wrestling manager who gets stranded in Kentucky and has to get his car fixed and discovers a lady mechanic. Actually, she's a blacksmith, this very large woman who he takes on as a new wrestler. So suddenly Humphrey Bogart is managing a lady wrestler in the middle of the mountains. It is one of his oddest films he made during his career. It's interesting, he always mentioned The Return of Dr. X as his worst movie, and he never brought up Swing Your Lady. It just showed that for this background, something that was going on there in, it didn't matter if it was Kentucky, if it was Alabama, wherever it might be, the major studios were looking kind of askance at stories with those backgrounds, and certainly were not focusing in on the people who were buying tickets.
Dear Charm School student, enclosed by number 3 of our Continental Correspondence course. It is entitled Your Allure. Allure. Allure is the magic of your emotion. Follow the instructions carefully. Lesson number 4 will be sent to you in a few days. You must ripple when you walk. Ripple.
Republic, I think, really became one of the major purveyors of movies that struck those audiences well. And one of the biggest stars that Republic had was Judy Canova. Now, Judy Canova had already been a hit on Broadway, and she was known as the Ozark Nightingale. She actually had an act with her brothers called the Three Georgia Crackers. And then she went solo and became this huge female star for Republic Pictures, doing movies like Lay Your Rifle Down and Joan of Ozark and Scatterbrain. And here she was a very good physical comedian, but she always sang in every one of her films, just like the other Republic stars like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. She also, like them, had her own recording career and radio shows. So when audiences went to see Judy Canova, they were going to see the girl that they were so familiar with from radio, and suddenly here she was doing the comedy and everything else that they loved about her in these movies. And the films were made for very little money because they were Republic Pictures, but they were making a fortune, and where they were making a fortune was in those southern states. And Monogram went ahead and did a series of Snuffy Smith films. These were done very cheaply, but he was a popular character in newspapers, and he was a hillbilly. He and his wife Louise, and they lived up there in the hills. They were always being chased around by revenuers and what have you. And probably the most successful installment of the series is the one where Snuffy Smith, in order to escape being busted for moonshine, joins the army. So they made it a hillbilly comedy and also a military comedy at once.
Yes. This is General Rosewater speaking.
Hi, General. Take a seat. I'm hearing you're needing some good shooting men for the army. I'm being the best squirrel shooter in the new United States. And me and old Tombstone will be fighting your war. And all I'm asking is a place to bed, victuals, gold buttons, $30 a month, and khaki breeches.
How did you get in here?
But the Monogram films were very, very successful on this independent theater circuit that existed, and they were booking these films from these studios. One of the formulas that worked very, very well during this period and would continue through the 50s and the 1960s was to get a country music act and then build a movie around them. And if you could get Hank Williams Sr. or Spade Cooley or Bob Wills or whoever it might be, they were like concert films, really. And they did them in two different ways. There were the shorts, and there were many of those. Warner Brothers actually did quite a few of those. And then also, again, PRC would do something like Grand Ole Opry, Jamboree, or what have you. And these were the movies that were hitting real money in these smaller towns, and it was like going to a concert.
It was pretty tough, but the more I thought about seeing you, darling, the easier it got.
What are you waiting for? Go ahead.
Say, that sounds real nice. I'd like to hear you ask for it. Keep it up. Beg some more.
What would you like me to say?
Well, you might say please very sweetly.
After World War II, sexuality in movies, really around the world, was becoming much more prevalent and much more adult. And the major studios, taking their cue from that and from what was going on in European cinema, etc., started also to make that much more of a selling point with their films. David O. Selznick took this to the next degree because Westerns were also following this. When Duel in the Sun comes out, there is just not a question in the world. This movie is about sex. It was promoted that way with the incredible images and things of Jennifer Jones, and it exploded.
Earl, you curb the flesh of temptation. Resistance is going to be a darn sight harder for you than for females protected by the shape of sows.
One of the great examples was Flamingo Road in Florida, starring Joan Crawford. And in fact, Jack Warner was so taken with the ad campaign with Joan leaning back, showing her legs with a cigarette dangling out of her mouth, that he said he wanted other films that they were making to be promoted the way Crawford showed her gams. There is an actual studio memo all about that. Setting it in with that background gave the studios an excuse to, let things loosen up a little bit, and everybody is, a lot more free with themselves, et cetera, et cetera.
In the grandest house on the smartest street in town, Flamingo Road. But what was the shadowy story behind her spectacular rise? Who were the men of power and influence who became the stepping stones that took her to Flamingo Road? Was it Dan who taught her to trust? Or was it Field who taught her to love?
What was going on, though, by the 1950s was that films set in the South and the smaller budgeted movies and exploitation movies were making a great deal of money. Variety published a headline around this time that was, in many ways, it was misleading, but it was trying to send a message. It said, "Sticks, Nicks, Hick, Picks." And that was halfway true and the other not. They felt that the, if you will, cornpone comedies and things like that had run their course, but what they weren't looking towards was the fact that you had exploitation movies that were coming up very, very fast, that were more explicit than anything the major studios were doing, while the major studios kept turning around and going, oh, if it's set in the South, then we can kind of step around censorship and what have you. Now, of course, on Broadway, the South as the setting for all types of sensual material was, of course, exploding because of Tennessee Williams. Streetcar Named Desire had set theatrical history. Elia Kazan made a movie that would kind of be like what we could say is the ultimate child bride film, and that was Baby Doll, starring Eli Wallach and Carol Baker. And this idea of an older man who marries a child but can't touch her until she passes a certain birthday, and it just frustrates him like crazy and leads to all sorts of problems. But it was a major studio movie dealing with something that everybody thought, well, no, that's kind of backwoods ideas and child molestation or whatever it is that anybody wanted to call it. That belongs down south. It doesn't belong in a major movie, but there it was.
People know the situation between us. There's no torture on earth to equal the torture which a cold woman inflicts on a man. There's no torture to compare with it. What I've done is staked out a lot in hell, a lot with a rotten house on it and 5 complete sets of furniture not paid for.
What you done is bit off more than you could chew.
The film itself now, looking at it, is not even that tame. That's very often the case when you look at something that's supposed to be so scandalous at the time it was made, but then you put it in some sort of perspective now, and it's like, wow, boy, they really got away with an awful lot. And that was absolutely true of Baby Doll. Richard Brooks, who would push the envelope himself when he would make Elmer Gantry with Burt Lancaster and Shirley Jones as the young prostitute in love with him, of course, all set in the South. But Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, he had to obey certain censorship rules because Maggie's husband is he or is he not gay? Of course, in the play, very much so. In the movie with Paul Newman, oh yeah, they kind of address it sideways. But there's Elizabeth Taylor lounging around saying, please go to bed with me. This was, again, it was like, oh my gosh, it's so adult. It is so a part of Southern culture. That was the message that was being sent by these movies, and people were picking up on it.
I'm gonna tell you about God's little acre. Very well, very well. I'm gonna tell you about God's little acre. Very well, very well. Oh, the men, they worked and they prayed to their maker. Very well, very well. In a crop of gold, they would be partaker. Very well, very well.
The doors are being blown off as far as censorship and anyway, holding back anything as far as suggestion and what have you, particularly, again, in movies with this background and this setting. One of the great examples is Anthony Mann's version of Erskine Caldwell's God's Little Acre. The presentation of Tina Louise in that movie is just astonishing, especially for the time. And again, these are hillbillies and they're rolling around with their own cousins and all of that type of stuff. And it was right there in a major film from a major director. Hollywood was kind of doing it two different ways. They're looking down their nose at the audience, yet making movies with characters that are very similar, they think, to the people who are buying the tickets in these states. When you went to B films, Mamie Van Doren, for example, did a number of movies. In fact, one in which she's sentenced to pick cotton, and she did Untamed Youth, and then in a film called Running Wild, which was a rodeo story. And it was almost a companion piece to a very, very good film, Nicholas Ray's The Lusty Men, which kind of threw aside the image of the clean-cut cowboy, certainly in the world of rodeo, with Robert Mitchum and Susan Hayward, and it's very frank in the fact that, look, if these guys weren't screwing each other over, they were screwing their wives. If you were sitting there going, oh my gosh, wait a minute, Roy Rogers and Red Ryder and any of these guys, Gene Autry, they sure wouldn't behave this way. Well, no, because this was a movie that was set in that world, in the South, and it showed it the way that it actually was. And these movies that were against this background, and again, always with this setting, were the ones that were kind of paving the way, along with European cinema, for something that was more frank and more adult.
Somebody's gonna get real fed up with you and beat your head in with a rake handle.
Who, your friend?
That could be.
See, the first thing you ever did on your own since I knew you. All you've been doing is dragging your foot in my stirrup.
You got anything to say to me, say it down at the stables.
Playing me for a sucker. Taking half my dough. Why? Because you ain't got guts enough to ride yourself. You're yellow.
One movie in particular, that was an independent, made by Robert Mitchum. He produced the film as well. He hired a director named Arthur Dreyfuss to direct the film, and the movie was Thunder Road. And it was about running moonshine. And Mitchum brooked no quarter. He had, of course, very famously, had already been to jail for marijuana. He had been on a chain gang, very small one, in Georgia when he was a wandering teenager. He had his own idea about who these guys were who were racing cars through the Carolinas to deliver moonshine, and who the FBI was that were always chasing them down and basically trying to ruin their lives, and certainly ruin their livelihood. And the film was an absolute smash, as it should have been. That was literally opening the door to showing stock car racing on film, stock car racing literally was born out of moonshine running. Plugging itself into automobile enthusiasm and racing enthusiasm and all of that, which was such a part of makeup of the audience in the South and would soon become a part of makeup of audiences worldwide, also opened, if you will, the road to later on to the Dukes of Hazzard as a television series. So you can actually trace the Dukes of Hazzard back to this Robert Mitchum film, because then suddenly it was like, wait a minute, this is relatable. These are guys who are trying to make a living, but they're running from the cops. And this has also become a very important sport in the Carolinas and in Virginia, because that wasn't Formula One. That was not Le Mans. This was guys with their own cars in their own garages going out and racing. And that was endemic to the southern states.
Nobody beats a federal murder rap. They'll stalk those ridges until there isn't a still left in Kentucky or Tennessee. You think it's that easy, huh? Now, how rough do you want it?
Horror movies also went in this direction, quite a number of them. The Alligator People, which is set in the swamps of Louisiana and has the wonderful Lon Chaney as the Cajun with the hook. I'll get you, alligator man, and he tries to attack Beverly Garland, and he's just going nuts while the mad scientist played by George McCready is turning people into actual alligators.
Inside this strange, forbidding plantation, on the edge of the death-laden bayous, there is a horror beyond belief. A scientist turns his cobalt rays on the revolting, scaly monarchs of the swamps to transform men into hideous, living gargoyles, whose faces must be forever hidden from human sight.
No less wild, but very much a part of the older man married to a younger gal, and they're living back in the swamps and having all kinds of problems. The attack of the giant leeches. And Bruno Vasoda is the big, fat, sloppy husband, and he's married to Yvette Vickers. Of course, she's a young sex bomb. He's always jealous of anybody who's paying his wife any attention. So, of course, if something like that happens, he marches them out into the middle of the swamp and either shoots them or lets them drown out there. Now they're all being attacked by the giant leeches. But that setting, that background, became just this perfect area for a horror picture. And horror films with ranch backgrounds, with set on farms, on kind of, if you will, the hinterlands, whether it was, say, Jacques Marquette's Teenage Monster or the Universal production, The Thing That Couldn't Die. There was always now going to be, if you will, a hint of the South in these films, the people and the characters and where they were and what they represented, whether you were a struggling farmer or you were doing something illegal or what have you. This was where all of these movies, they were kind of starting to filter into that area to films made in Texas that also reflected that. The Giant Gila Monster and the Killer Shrews, both of which very Southern in their background. They were both made in Texas and about locals fighting monsters. But this idea of being remote, being separated from a big city, was perfect for these stories set in the South. And these characters, who are kind of ne'er-do-wells, are getting in trouble with monsters.
It is in these lonely areas of impenetrable forest and dark shadows that the Gila monster still lives.
Little Abner came roaring back right out of the comics onto Broadway as a musical that was incredibly successful. So Paramount makes their own Little Abner movie, but the musical. And of course, to have the women represented the way Al Capp and his assistant Frank Frazetta drew them, suddenly you have the creation of the super short shorts, Daisy Dukes, suddenly it was like, wow, this is, like the next best thing is going to, if you could find a strip club in the hinterlands, then this was the next best thing to it. It broke a number of rules, again, because it was a musical, but there the ladies were, and they were presented in full-on and as true objects of desire from the Deep South. Through the southern states, the adults-only exploitation business exploded, particularly films coming out of Florida from filmmakers like Doris Wishman with Nude on the Moon and Hideout in the Sun, and Barry Mann, who had once been Errol Flynn's business partner, made a ton of these movies. Sometimes it was featuring one particular lady and they were playing volleyball or what have you, and then they would try and lace a story around the nudity, such as The Beast That Killed Women. In that case, it was a fellow in a gorilla suit who invades a nudist colony. But these exploitation movies were hitting into the independent drive-ins and those smaller theaters, and they were making a fortune. Now, when they would go to the big cities, it would be in some smaller urban area theater and what have you, and they were still generating the money, but it was not making the money that the quote-unquote redneck circuit was making. Barry Mann also really hit on all cylinders when he made Naked Moonshine, which may have been the ultimate perfect title for this theater circuit and what the potential audience would be, because now suddenly the idea of seeing nudity, frankly, in movies was no longer something that was taboo. You might have had to hunt for it, but it was there, and opened up the door for a whole nother level of Southern exploitation, one of whom the masters of it turned out to be a filmmaker from Chicago, and that was Herschel Gordon Lewis.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to witness some scenes from the next attraction to play this theater. This picture, truly one of the most unusual ever filmed, contains scenes which under no circumstances should be viewed by anyone with a heart condition or anyone who is easily upset.
By 1964, Herschel Gordon Lewis had already just hit the mother lode with Blood Feast, which he made in Florida. And it made so much money, he decided to really push the envelope even more with a Florida-produced film that would hit very specifically the southern market where so many of his movies were being played. And it wasn't just there. He was in the inner cities too, but as he said, quote unquote, if I can't make my money back in the South, then I'm in trouble. His answer to that was 2000 Maniacs, a film about a young couple from the North, of course, driving into a small town, not realizing that the town itself is essentially a haven for psychopaths that resurrects itself every 100 years or so, and they attack and devour and destroy anyone who comes in contact with them. Lewis was very enthusiastic about the movie and very proud of it, particularly one shot where he got the local fire department helping him do a wide shot of this town. The film was made in a town called St. Cloud, Florida, with a Confederate flag in the corner of the frame, overlooking this entire town of psychopaths. But this was a real lesson for film distributors about the gold mine that existed in those states, especially for independents.
The kicks never stop for the racing set. They live it up and love it up at a restless pace, driven by the racing fever in their blood.
Regional filmmakers like William Griffey from Florida, his films, now he was making some horror movies, but during this period he was making films that actually were about racing. So films like Checkered Flag that was perfect for that audience. And it's interesting because those films, like what Greffet was making before he really hit it with Stanley and some of his great horror films later on, were the exact same movies and for that audience that Elvis Presley was making. So Speedway and Spin Out and all of that stuff. And one of his big hits at the time was the hillbilly comedy Kissin' Cousins. There was no denying the success of that film. And in fact, it became such a, if you will, almost a template for a lot of Presley's later movies during the 1960s, when he would do something like Tickle Me.
And this is Home Sweet Home, up in them thar mountains. At supper time, you better be quick or go hungry.
Tain't nothing but possum tails, owl gizzards, and grits, with vulture eggs and mashed catfish eyes.
The catfish eyes brings out the flavor of the possum tails.
Now, Sam Katzman was a very smart man, basically dominating the low-budget world. And when he was at MGM in the very early 60s, he saw the writing on the wall for movies that were similar to what he had done in the early 50s with movies like Twist All Night and Rock Around the Clock, where he would feature, whether it was Little Richard or Bill Haley and the Comets, he would then build movies around country music acts. And one of the his bigger ones was Hootenanny Hoot. And there, Peter Breck and Ruta Lee are TV executives. And what is a Hootenanny Hoot? And they're driving all over the country to experience what was going on college campuses and everything else as an excuse to feature musical acts. And in Hootenanny Hoot, the big act, of course, Sheb Woolley was in it, but more importantly, so was Johnny Cash.
A world that digs folk singing and country music the most, and they dig it for $10 million a year. What'd you say? Dollar?
What's a hootenanny?
It was so much of a success that Katzman started looking at the biographies of country music stars, but his most successful was the biography of Hank Williams, Your Cheatin' Heart. Hamilton is one of his best performances. The film was made for, it was a low MGM movie, but it was a low-budget MGM movie, and the tatters do show, but it hit because the audience at those drive-ins and across those states wanted to see that movie.
I'm Boots Malone, your host. Come on, join the fun. We're having a wake for our dear departed boss and friend, the unluckiest crapshooter this side of the Las Vegas Strip. The only thing he ever won was this joint and my contract. Neither was change's luck. So drink up. The drinks are on the house.
The musical variety format really kind of, I don't know, you'd say reached its height or its nadir with two movies. Las Vegas Hillbillies with Ferlin Husky and Sonny James is also the only movie that featured both Jane Mansfield and Mamie Van Doren. It was about a talent agent, in this case Jane Mansfield, trying to promote Ferlin Husky and Sonny James and some other country music acts and finding a venue for them in Las Vegas, but they have to fight gangsters in order to get the booking dates. Let's get the country bumpkins up against the city slickers, and in fact the country bumpkins are going to win, and in the meantime you get to hear this music. The film was very successful and was followed up by Hillbillies in a Haunted House. Now, Jane had tragically died in the car accident, so her role in the sequel was played by Joy Lansing with, again, Ferlin Husky and Sonny James and a very young Merle Haggard. But in this case, they try and outwit a group of spies who are trying to operate their crime syndicate without interference, and here comes the country music gang. They, suffer the wrath of Basil Rathbone and John Carradine and Lon Chaney and a giant gorilla. But it was another showcase for musical talent. That's what it was. It was like turning on the TV and watching a variety show. And again, for that marketplace, absolutely perfect.
The glamorous Joy Lansing.
Well, now on Monday I'm your darling, on Tuesday I'm your baby, but on Wednesday you don't...
The Hillbillies in a Haunted House.
In 1967, I would say you don't want to call it the ultimate Hicksploitation movie because it won Academy Awards and was a wonderful film, but was, in a way, the true statement from the movie studios on what they assumed life in the South was about, and that was Bonnie and Clyde. That movie, with, of course, Foggy Mountain Breakdown played on the banjos, the heightened violence, the interplay and the sexual relationship between Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, and you know how that finally happened, and all of these things, plus these wonderful supporting with Estelle Parsons and Michael J. Pollard and Gene Hackman playing Southerners who were caught up in crime because they were enthusiastic about it and because they were poor. The film, set in the 30s, in this background with this music score and everything else, becomes an absolute Academy Award-winning smash, a smash, by the way, that Warner Brothers had very little faith in, hit a nerve with young people. And it was not just young people throughout the South, it was young people around the world. And they saw it as this great anti-establishment statement, and that they could latch onto. And of course, the violence was echoing in their minds what was going on in Vietnam.
Where you going?
Get away!
Bonnie!
So old!
Honey?
Please, honey, don't never leave me without saying nothing.
Now, this is the exact same time that you have to look at what was going on in television culturally. Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, The Beverly Hillbillies, The Andy Griffith Show, Gomer Pyle, all shows either set in the South or with prominent Southern characters. And they were being embraced across the networks. And 1969, TV syndication broke all records with Hee Haw. And absolutely no one could have predicted, except those who knew on the inside of the country music scene, that this would literally take over the country. The rise of Dolly Parton and Merle Haggard, and then very soon Willie Nelson, and of course Johnny Cash just exploded, was something that was almost unprecedented, because it didn't just mean these acts were being embraced with record sales and TV specials and all the rest of it. It meant that their culture that they came from was also being embraced, so that by the 1970s, there would be a singular movie star, others would follow, but one movie star who would come to absolutely, completely personify the South, and how a Southern boy can go in and take control of absolutely everything around him, whether he's breaking the law or he's a detective or whatever it is, and that was Burt Reynolds. But all of this had happened before Burt. And so he was completely poised with movies like White Lightning and Gator, and of course Smokey and the Bandit, to take control of this cultural phenomenon that just kept growing and growing and growing throughout the 1970s. But you could actually say, look, there was Burt, but way back when, there was Child Bride and Moonshine Molly and Judy Canova and all of these other performers who were embraced and loved by a certain audience in a certain part of the country that became important to major studios as a source of revenue.